For 3 years, Vivian Ashcroft stood beside one of New York's most dangerous men, not as a wife, but as a fixture, silent, invisible, waiting. The night she stopped waiting, everything Rafael Moretti thought he owned began to fall apart. What happens when the most feared man in the city realizes the one person he never paid attention to was the only one who ever mattered? This is their story. Stay until the end. You won't see the last turn coming. If this one hits you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The penthouse sat on the 54th floor of a building that cost more than most men earned in 10 lifetimes, and Vivian Ashcroft had spent the better part of 3 years staring out its floor-to-ceiling windows at a city that didn't know her name. That wasn't entirely true. Some people knew her name, the doormen knew it, the florists who delivered the weekly arrangements of white orchids knew it. The charity coordinators, the hospital administrators, the quiet nonprofit directors who received anonymous wire transfers at the end of every quarter, they knew her name. But the city itself, the one that plastered Rafael Moretti's face across gossip columns and federal surveillance files with equal enthusiasm, that city knew Vivian Ashcroft only as his wife. An appendage, a footnote to a larger story. She had made peace with that. Or she had told herself she had, which amounts to the same lie, repeated often enough that it starts to feel like truth. It was a Thursday night in November when the lie finally cracked. The Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala was held at the Langford Hotel, one of those grand midtown institutions that still bothered with chandeliers and real floral centerpieces and waitstaff who moved like ghosts between the tables. Vivian had organized half the silent auction herself, working with the foundation's development team for 6 weeks to secure the donations, draft the descriptions, arrange the display tables. She wore a navy gown, understated, which was how she preferred to appear in rooms like this. And she had arrived alone, as she almost always did, with the understanding that Rafael would join her before the keynote. He was running late. He was always running late. She wasn't bitter about it anymore. That was the thing she had learned about grief that nobody tells you. Eventually, bitterness burns itself out too. What's left is something quieter and far more dangerous. Acceptance edged with exhaustion. The particular stillness of a woman who has stopped expecting anything. She stood near the bar at the edge of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water she wasn't drinking, when she heard his laugh. Rafael's laugh was distinctive, low, controlled, the kind of sound that a man produces when he's amused but doesn't want to give the amusement too much ground. She knew it better than she knew almost anything about him. She had studied him the way you study a language you will never be truly fluent in. He was standing with 3 men near the corridor entrance. She recognized 2 of them, Dominic Farrell, who ran import operations out of Red Hook and had the permanent look of someone doing arithmetic in his head, and a man she knew only as Casero, who smiled too broadly for someone in his line of work. The third she didn't know. Young, expensive suit, the careful posture of someone trying to impress. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She was simply standing in a room where voices carried, and the acoustics of the Langford's mezzanine had always been particular. Later, she would think about that, the specific cruelty of good architecture. "Look at her now," Casero was saying, nodding toward someone Vivian couldn't see. 3 years in and she's still hauling him to charity circuits like it's going to change something. Rafael made a sound. Not quite agreement, not quite dismissal. The sound of a man who's been asked a question he finds mildly tedious. "Come on," the young one said. He had the accent of someone from outside the city, trying hard to belong to it. "You're telling me she's not... she's your wife. There's got to be something there." "She's my wife on paper." Rafael's voice was even, flat, even, the voice he used when discussing logistics. Nothing more. Vivian heard the words the way you hear an accident. The instant before it fully registers, there's a fraction of a second where the brain refuses. She felt the glass in her hand, the weight of it, the condensation on her palm. Someone 3 tables over laughed at something. The string quartet in the corner was playing something slow. Then it registered. She didn't cry. She was past crying about Rafael Moretti. What she felt instead was something she could only describe later, to no one. In the dark of the bedroom he almost never slept in. A door closing. Not slamming, not breaking off its hinges, just swinging shut on oiled hardware, quiet and final and complete. She set her glass on the nearest surface and walked to her table. She sat through the keynote. She applauded at the right moments. She spoke to the foundation director about the auction results and said all the correct things. When Raphael found her an hour later, his hand went to the small of her back. In the gesture she had once interpreted as affection and had long since understood was territorial habit, and she smiled at the people around them, and she said nothing. She had become very good at saying nothing. The car ride home was quiet. Raphael spent it on his phone. Not talking, just reading, scrolling through something, his jaw set in the particular way it got when he was working through a problem. His driver, Marco, navigated the FDR with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for years. Vivian watched the lights of the bridges blur past the window. "Good event?" Raphael said, not looking up. "Productive," she said. "How much did they raise?" "Enough." He nodded, filed it away, returned to his phone. That was the sum of it. That was, she realized, the sum of most of their evenings. Efficient exchanges of information between two people sharing a square footage. She had been so focused on the absence of warmth that she had not fully registered until that night that it wasn't absence, it was replacement. She had been replaced in his calculus by the machinery of whatever he was building out there in the parts of his life he kept behind closed doors and NDA-protected associates. She had been naive enough at the beginning to think she could reach him. Not naive in the way people assume. She had known what Raphael Moretti was when she entered this arrangement. Her family had been clear-eyed about it. Her father's legal troubles and the very particular kind of help the Moretti organization had provided, the understanding that a marriage would consolidate the relationship between the families, the protection it afforded her father's remaining assets. She had understood all of it. She had walked in with open eyes. What she had not anticipated, and this was the naivety, the real kind, the kind that survives clear-eyed realism because it lives somewhere underneath the intellect, was that it would hurt. She had not anticipated wanting more than the arrangement promised, had not anticipated lying awake listening for the sound of a key in the lock at 2 a.m, calculating the hours, telling herself it didn't matter, feeling it matter anyway. She was done, not dramatically, not with screaming or thrown objects, done the way a candle goes out when there's no wax left, quietly, without ceremony, because there was simply nothing left to burn. Boss. The attorney's name was Sylvia Park, and she had an office on Lexington that looked deliberately unimpressive from the outside. You could walk past it 100 times and never notice it, which was, Vivian understood, the point. The women who came to Sylvia Park were not women who wanted to be noticed. Vivian had found her through a series of careful recommendations. A friend of a foundation contact, referred through a mutual channel that had nothing to do with anything connected to Raphael or anyone who moved in his world. She had been careful about that. She had been thinking about this for longer than she was comfortable admitting, and she had been careful in direct proportion to how serious she was. The first meeting was 3 days after the gala. Sylvia Park was in her mid-50s, small, with the kind of precision in her movements that suggested she had long since learned not to waste energy. She listened to Vivian for 40 minutes without writing anything down, which Vivian found either unnerving or reassuring depending on which moment she was in. "You understand the complexity," Sylvia said. It wasn't a question. "I understand that his lawyers will be very well funded," Vivian said. "I'm not concerned about the settlement. I don't want his money." Sylvia looked at her, the look of someone recalibrating. "Most women in your position—" "I'm aware of what most women in my position do." Vivian folded her hands in her lap. "I want out, a clean exit. I want my name back, and I want to be far enough from New York that his world stops being my world. The financials are secondary. His people will push back. He won't contest it." The attorney's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted. "You seem very certain." "I know him," Vivian said, and then more quietly, "I've spent 3 years learning everything about a man who never bothered to learn anything about me. That kind of study leaves you with information. He won't want the exposure. He won't want the narrative." Sylvia picked up her pen. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about what a clean exit looks like." The weeks that followed had a strange quality to them, doubled somehow, existing on 2 tracks simultaneously. On one track, Vivian continued being Vivian Moretti, wife of Raphael, attendant of events, occupant of the penthouse, exchanger of efficient information over quiet car rides. On the other track, she was quietly, methodically, constructing the infrastructure of a different life. She opened a bank account under her maiden name at a branch in Midtown she had never used before. She contacted the State Bar of Massachusetts. She had let her license lapse 5 years ago, before the marriage, and the reinstatement process was straightforward enough. She reached out to a former colleague at a nonprofit law firm in Boston who had once, years ago, offered her a position she had turned down for reasons that felt very different now than they had then. She began searching for apartments in the Back Bay, the kind of quiet, manageable spaces that were the opposite of the penthouse in every way she could measure. She did all of this with the same composure she brought to foundation work. Organized, methodical, compartmentalized. The emotions were there. She wasn't made of stone, and 3 years of a life, even a life that had failed to become what she'd hoped, was not something you dismantled without feeling the weight of it. But she had learned, in this marriage, how to carry weight without letting it show. That skill, at least, had been useful. What she had not expected was how much it steadied her. Each step she completed, each account opened, each credential renewed, each conversation had, each form signed, felt less like loss and more like recovery. Like finding, one room at a time, pieces of herself she had been storing somewhere out of reach. She had been a person before Rafael Moretti. She was becoming that person again. While Rafael, during this period, noticed nothing. Or rather, and this was something Vivian thought about with a particular complicated feeling, he noticed just enough to misread entirely. She had stopped waiting. She wasn't watching the clock for him, wasn't listening for the elevator, wasn't braced for disappointment when dinner went cold and the night grew late. That release of tension, the way it smoothed out her presence around him, the way she stopped carrying the particular exhaustion of someone hoping for something. He interpreted it as contentment. He had told Dominic Farrell, she would learn much later, that he thought the marriage had settled, that Vivian seemed more herself, more at ease. He wasn't entirely wrong. She was more at ease. The inference he drew from that fact was simply catastrophically incorrect. She watched him during the evenings he was home, which was perhaps 3 nights a week. And even then, home meant physically present in the apartment while occupying a different dimension of reality, visible through the glass walls of his home office, moving through the kitchen at odd hours, occasionally falling asleep on the couch with a file in his lap. She watched him with the strange doubling of someone who is both inside an experience and simultaneously reviewing the footage. He was not ugly. That was not irrelevant, and she wasn't ashamed to note it. Rafael Moretti was a striking man, the kind of physical presence that a room accommodated without quite knowing why. Dark eyes, a face that had the quality of something carved rather than grown, all planes and angles, and the particular character that came from a life that had asked hard things of him. He was 41 years old and looked like every year of it in a way that improved rather than diminished him, which was deeply unfair. But she had long since stopped being able to separate the face from what she now knew lived behind it. Not cruelty, exactly. Rafael was not a cruel man, which had been one of her original miscalculations. She had expected cold cruelty and found instead something subtler and, in its own way, harder to withstand. He simply did not see her. She moved through his life like furniture he had grown accustomed to, useful and unremarkable. And the problem with furniture is that you don't register its absence until you trip over the space it left. Bon. She found the apartment in Boston in February. 3rd floor of a brownstone on Marlborough Street. 2 bedrooms, high ceilings, windows that looked out over a row of trees that would be bare until April, and beautiful after that. It was half the size of the penthouse's guest room. She put a deposit on it the same day she saw it. She went back to New York and sat in the kitchen at 11 at night and drank a cup of tea and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not quite happiness but was close enough to it to be recognizable. Something that might become happiness, given space and time and the particular mercy of distance. She had set a date in her mind, their anniversary. It was specific and deliberate. She did not want to leave without telling him. Disappearing in the night felt like something that required a kind of anger she didn't have, and it also felt like dishonesty, and whatever else Vivian Ashcroft was, she had never been dishonest. She would hand him the papers herself. She would look at him and say what was true. And then she would leave. March arrived like it always does in New York. Grudgingly, still wearing winter's leftover bad temper, the street still gray and wet. Vivienne completed her bar reinstatement paperwork and received confirmation 2 weeks before the anniversary. She called her former colleague in Boston, whose name was Daniel Osei, and told him she was available after the 15th. He was quiet for a moment and then said simply, "I'll have a desk ready." She began packing. Not everything. Not in a way that would register to anyone who didn't know to look. A few boxes marked for donation. Books she had brought from her pre-marriage apartment, quietly transferred to a storage unit in Queens that Raphael had no reason to know about. Photographs of her own family, her own history. The artifacts of a life she had placed in storage 3 years ago to make room in the penthouse for a marriage that never materialized. She wasn't sad packing those things. She was careful. She kept the white orchids in the vase on the entry table. She kept everything in its place until the day itself. Their anniversary was on a Saturday that year, the 15th. She had the papers ready, Sylvia Park had filed them, and they were waiting, and there was nothing left to do but hand them over. She had them in a cream-colored envelope in the drawer of her vanity table, unremarkable among the other correspondence she kept there. The day passed the way days do when you are waiting for a specific moment in them, sluggishly, each hour longer than the one before. She went to the gym in the building's lower level, swam 30 laps, showered, dressed. She had a lunch meeting with the hospital foundation she worked with, and she attended it, and she was present and useful in it. And none of the people around the table would have guessed that she was living in 2 moments simultaneously, the one she was in and the one she was waiting for. She was home by 4. She changed into something simple. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter where he would see it when he came in. The penthouse had been prepared by the building's concierge team. White candles, white orchids, the kind of minimal, elegant staging the building offered for anniversaries, and other occasions Raphael's assistant had flagged in advance. It looked like the set of a life. A performance of intimacy, all the props in place, hollow at the center. She sat in the living room and waited. He was late. Of course. He arrived at 9:15, which was later than she'd expected, and he came in carrying a velvet box and wearing the expression of a man who had accomplished something by showing up. He handed her the box without ceremony. Inside it was a diamond bracelet, the kind that cost more than most people's cars. She set it on the counter beside the envelope. "What's this?" he said, nodding at the envelope. She looked at him for a moment. She was aware in a strange, distant way of her own pulse. Steady, slower than you might expect. She thought she would feel more in this moment. She thought there would be something dramatic in the architecture of it, some surge of feeling to match the significance. But she felt instead a kind of clarity. The absolute certainty of someone who has made a decision they know is right. "It's what it looks like," she said. He picked it up, opened it. She watched his eyes move across the first page and stop. The silence that followed was the longest she had ever heard from him. Raphael Moretti was not a man who was silenced. He operated in a world of constant language, orders given, negotiations conducted, threats communicated in the careful diction of men who understood that words were currency and ammunition both. She had never seen him without language. He had it now. "Vivienne, I've retained counsel," she said. "Everything is in order. I'm not contesting any of the shared assets. I don't want anything from the estate. I want the exit." "You want—" He stopped. His jaw was moving slightly, like he was translating something difficult. "You want to leave?" "I'm leaving," she said. "Not I want to. Tonight." He looked up from his papers. And this was the thing she had not fully prepared for. The thing that, for just a moment, unsettled the clarity she had been carrying, the expression on his face. She had expected anger. She had half expected the cold, controlled fury she had seen him deploy in other contexts, the particular compression of his presence when someone had crossed a line he'd drawn. She had even, in some distant part of herself, expected relief. His relief. The institutional relief of a man freed from an obligation he'd never much wanted. What she saw instead was something she didn't have a word for. Not quite fear. Something in the neighborhood of fear. Something that lived near it. Some expression she had never seen cross his face in 3 years of living alongside him. "Wait," he said. The word was almost foreign in his mouth. Raphael Moretti did not say wait. He did not ask. He did not appeal. Just wait. She picked up her coat from the chair where she had placed it, and her bag. and she looked at him once more. In 3 years of marriage, she realized, she had never truly seen him uncertain. She had not known he was capable of it. "The papers are straightforward," she said. "Sylvia Park's information is on the cover page." She walked to the door. "Where are you going?" His voice had changed. Something in it she couldn't name and didn't want to spend time naming. She opened the door. Vivian. Not a command. Something else. Something raw in it that she had waited 3 years to hear and was now, paradoxically, too late. She stepped into the hallway. The elevator was already at their floor. She had called it before he arrived, a small practical decision that now felt almost unkind in its precision. She stepped in. The doors closed. The last thing she saw, before they did, was Rafael Moretti standing in the doorway of the penthouse, divorce papers in one hand, the diamond bracelet still in its box on the counter behind him, and an expression on his face that she had never, in 3 years, thought to look for. He looked, for the first time, like a man who understood what he was losing. The elevator descended. She did not cry. Not then. She would cry later in the car to Boston, somewhere around New Haven, when the skyline of New York had disappeared completely behind her. A brief, private grief. Not for the marriage, which had never truly existed, but for the woman who had spent 3 years hoping it would. She cried for her, and then she stopped, and she drove the rest of the way with the window cracked and the cold March air coming in. And when she reached the brownstone on Marlborough Street in the early hours of the morning and stood on the sidewalk looking up at the dark windows of the apartment that was now hers, she felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of. She felt like herself. What she did not know, what she could not have known, standing on that Boston sidewalk in the cold, was what was happening in the penthouse she had just left. What Rafael Moretti did after the elevator doors closed, after the silence of the apartment pressed in on him from all sides, after he stood holding papers that said, in the careful language of the law, that he had failed at the one thing no amount of money or influence or organizational power had prepared him to do. She did not know that he read every page, that he stood in the kitchen for an hour without moving, reading and rereading words he had never expected to see, trying to identify the moment, the specific, locatable moment, when something had shifted so profoundly that this had become possible. She did not know that he called Dominic Farrell at midnight, said nothing when Dominic picked up, and hung up after a long silence that Dominic would describe later as the strangest call he'd ever received. She did not know that he walked through the apartment for most of the night, touching things. Her books, the ones she hadn't taken, the notebooks she kept, the photographs on her desk, the foundation correspondence she organized by project and date. He moved through the rooms like a man in a house that had been searched, looking for something, not finding it, beginning to understand that what he was looking for had walked out the door with her. And she did not know that somewhere around 3 in the morning, standing in the center of the living room with the candles burned down and the orchids still white and perfect in their vases, Rafael Moretti sat down on the floor. Not in the chair, not on the couch. The floor. Like the height of everything in the room had suddenly become too much. He sat there, in the dark, with the papers beside him, and did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He thought about who he was, not what he commanded or controlled or owned, who he was. And the answer that came back to him in the silence of that apartment was something he was not ready to hold, but it was the beginning of something, though he didn't know it yet. A crack in the architecture of the man he had become. Outside, the city moved, indifferent, as cities are. 30 blocks south, a woman he had dismissed as his wife on paper was carrying her bags through a darkened lobby and up a flight of stairs to a life he knew nothing about. And Rafael Moretti sat on the floor of his 54-story penthouse, the most powerful man in the room, the only man in the room, and felt for the first time in years the specific and unmistakable weight of being entirely alone. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he would begin to understand why. By morning, something would have changed in him. Not enough, not yet, but the first thread, the beginning of an unraveling that no territory dispute or organizational threat had ever managed to produce. By morning, he would start to realize that he didn't know the first true thing about the woman he had just lost. And the question that would stay with him, the one that would follow him into every room and every meeting and every empty night in the months to come, was not whether he could get her back. It was whether he deserved to. The morning after felt like the morning after a war, except there was no enemy to point to, no damage he could map onto a landscape and call the cause. Rafael Moretti had survived ambushes, federal investigations, 3 attempts on his life in 11 years, and a hostile takeover of the Red Hook operation that had cost him 2 men and 6 months of sleep. He had walked out of all of it intact, or close enough to intact that the difference didn't show in any room that mattered. He had not survived a night on the floor of his own living room. He didn't register that he was still sitting there until Marco knocked at 7:15. The knock was the kind Marco used when he was uncertain. 2 taps, then a pause, then one more. The rhythm of a man who had learned to read the temperature of a room through a closed door. Rafael heard it and didn't move for a long moment. His back had stiffened. The candles were pools of solidified wax on their holders. The orchids were still white and perfect, because orchids are indifferent to human catastrophe, and he found that offensive in a way he couldn't articulate. He got up. His knees were bad from an old injury he never talked about, and they reminded him of this now, loudly. He went to the door. Marco looked at him the way you look at someone when you're not going to say what you're seeing. He had worked for Rafael for 9 years. He knew the difference between his employer's moods the way a ship's navigator knows the difference between weather systems. What he was looking at now was not a mood he had a name for. "Morning," Marco said. "Push everything before noon," Rafael said. Marco nodded. No questions. Dominic called. "I know." I know." Rafael stepped back from the door. "Give me an hour." He showered, he dressed. He stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee he didn't drink and looked at the place where the envelope had been, which now held nothing but the slight shadow of a rectangle where it had sat. He had moved the papers to his desk at some point in the night. He didn't remember doing it. The diamond bracelet was still in its box. He picked it up, looked at it for a moment, butting $47,000 worth of a gesture he had never bothered to make personal, and put it in a drawer without knowing why he was keeping it. He called Sylvia Park's office at 8:05. He got a voicemail. He did not leave a message. He called his own attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled every legal matter of consequence in Rafael's professional life for 15 years. Gerald picked up on the first ring, which meant he already knew. "I need you to look at something," Rafael said. "I've seen it," Gerald said. Carefully. Silence. "She's entitled," Gerald said. "The terms are actually... they're fair, Rafael. Unusually fair. She's not taking anything that isn't... I didn't ask for an assessment." "Then what are you asking for?" Rafael turned and looked out the window. The city was doing what the city always did. Existing, loudly, without reference to anything happening inside this apartment. 54 floors below him, people were carrying coffee cups and hailing cabs and living lives of a manageable, horizontal scale. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in a very long time. Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to contest it?" The word sat in the air. Contest. He thought about what that would mean. His lawyers against hers. Depositions. The particular ugliness of a legal proceeding in which everything that had not happened in a marriage would have to be documented and argued about in rooms full of strangers. He thought about what she had said. The papers are straightforward, the composure of it, the precision. She had not been angry. That was the thing that kept returning to him. She had not been angry, and he understood now that this was worse than anger. Anger meant there was still something to reach, some live wire still connected. What he had seen in her face last night was the absence of anything to reach. A door that had been closed so long it had grown over with something permanent. "No," he said. Gerald exhaled. "Rafael, don't." "You should at least..." Gerald. The name landed hard. The room went quiet on both ends of the line. "Don't tell me what I should do." He hung up. He picked up his coffee. He finally drank some of it, cold now, tasting like something left behind. Dominic Farrell was at the office on West Street by 9. He was sitting in the chair across from Rafael's desk with the look of a man who had been rehearsing this conversation since midnight and was now discovering that none of his rehearsed lines were going to work. "You look terrible," Dominic said. "Thank you." When did she..." He stopped, tried again. I didn't know it was that bad. Raphael looked at him steadily. Neither did I. That landed differently than Dominic expected. He shifted in his chair. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been rearranged once by a pipe and had healed imperfectly, and he had the particular discomfort of someone who was accustomed to knowing what to do and currently had no idea. So, what do you want to do? Dominic said. About which part? Any of it. Raphael leaned back in his chair. He had a meeting in an hour with the Kellerman Group, a real estate operation they were cleaning money through that had developed some friction around its northern portfolio. He had a call at 2 with their contact at the Port Authority about a timing issue with the February shipment. He had, by his count, 11 things scheduled today that were not nothing, that were in fact the load-bearing architecture of everything he had spent 15 years building, and he was sitting here unable to name which of those things he currently cared about, which was a feeling so foreign to him that he didn't have a framework for it. Business runs, he said. Nothing changes there. Dominic nodded. And personally? That's not your department. It came out harder than he meant it. Dominic absorbed it without expression, which was something Raphael genuinely respected about him. The man could take the sharp edge of a bad mood and not make it into an event. Sorry, Raphael said, which was also not something he said often. Dominic looked at him. She's good people, he said, carefully. The statement of someone walking across uncertain ground. I always thought... He stopped. What? Nothing. Dominic. The big man exhaled. He looked at the desk, not at Raphael. I always thought you didn't see her right. The work she does, the way she handles herself. My wife used to come home from those foundation events and say Vivian Moretti was the only real person in the room. He paused. I thought it was a compliment. Raphael's jaw was tight. It was. Yeah, Dominic stood. Well, he left without more. The door closed behind him. Raphael sat with what Dominic had said. The particular precision of it, the thing his own wife had apparently understood about Vivian that he had not, as if being adjacent to something through a partner's description was enough to see it clearly, and proximity through a marriage was somehow not. He opened his laptop. He searched her name, which felt strange. She was his wife, or had been, and he was searching her name on a computer like a stranger. The results were not what he expected. Not nothing, not the purely social results of a public figure's spouse. There was substance here. Articles, press releases, hospital announcements, nonprofit newsletters. Vivian Ashcroft Moretti's name appeared in the acknowledgement section of a pediatric cancer unit renovation, in the donor list of 3 different scholarship funds, in the founding board of a legal aid organization for immigrant women he had never heard of. He read for 40 minutes. He was late for the Kellerman meeting. He didn't notice until his phone started ringing. The week that followed was the most disorienting of Raphael Moretti's adult life, and his adult life had contained disorienting weeks of some objective magnitude. He functioned. He met and called and decided and directed because that was what he did. That was the infrastructure of him. And it ran on something that had long since stopped requiring his full attention. The business of the business continued, but underneath it, something had come loose. He went back to his laptop at night. He read everything. The foundation she had co-founded in 2019 before the marriage that provided emergency legal services to domestic violence survivors. The annual hospital gala she organized for the pediatric wing, which had raised over $2 million across 3 years. The scholarship fund through Columbia Law bearing the name of a woman Vivian had apparently helped, a woman named Dora, no last name in the article, a survivor of something the article described in careful general terms that made the details easy enough to infer. He had been married to this woman for 3 years. He had known none of this. He had known she attended charity events. He had assumed it was the expected performance of a certain kind of wife, the particular philanthropy of women who have nothing to do with their time and money and status. He had assumed it with the casual confidence of someone who has never interrogated his own assumptions. The assumptions were not close to accurate. They weren't even in the same territory as accurate. She had been doing real work. The kind of work that changed the specific, granular texture of people's lives. Not press release work, not check writing work, but legal advocacy and direct service funding, and the unglamorous labor of showing up consistently to organizations that needed someone to show up. She had been doing it beside him, in the margins of his life, the part of the schedule he hadn't noticed because he had never looked at it directly. He closed his laptop at 2 in the morning on the 5th night and sat in the dark of his home office for a long time, and he was honest with himself in a way he rarely allowed. And what he was honest about was this. He had not looked because he had not thought she was worth looking at. Not because he disliked her, not because of some active cruelty. Because of something worse. The passive, unthinking dismissal of someone who didn't register as significant. A piece of furniture, a chess piece, my wife on paper, nothing more. The words came back to him now with a quality they hadn't had when he'd said them. He had said them without thinking. That was the damnation of it. They had come out that smoothly, that easily, because they reflected something he actually believed, something he had organized his understanding of the marriage around without ever deciding to, without ever making the conscious choice. He had never made the conscious choice to see her. That was the thing. It wasn't a decision. It was the absence of one. On the 9th day, Casero called. Vincent Casero was not a careful man, which had always been one of Raphael's reservations about him. Kept private because Casero was useful, and his contacts in the Southern distribution network were irreplaceable for the moment. He called at 6:30 in the evening, which was early for him, and his voice had the particular texture of someone who thought he was being casual and wasn't quite achieving it. "Heard about the situation," Casero said. Raphael was standing at the window. The light over the Hudson was doing something complicated, orange and flat at the same time. "Which situation?" "With Vivienne." A pause. "Shame about that. She's a class act." "Yes," Raphael said. Flat. "My wife ran into someone who knows someone in Boston. Said she's settling in." Raphael's hand tightened on the phone. He kept his voice exactly where it was. "Good for her." "Right." Casero's voice shifted slightly, more comfortable now, finding the frequency he'd been trying to locate. "Listen, some of the guys were thinking about next month, the thing in Atlantic City, and there was a question about the table arrangements, whether you'd be bringing anyone or if you'd rather—" "Vincent." "Yeah." "Don't call me to talk about my marriage." The silence was brief. "I'm not—" "You are." Raphael turned away from the window. His voice had not risen. It had done the opposite, compressed, quiet, with the density of something very small and very heavy. "The next time you mention my wife's name in a sentence I didn't invite you to, I'm going to have a conversation with you about it in a different context. Are we clear?" Silence. "Vincent?" "Yeah." The word came out differently than before. "Yeah, we're clear." "Good." Raphael hung up. He stood very still for a moment, breathing. His heart rate was up, which was not about Casero. Casero was a small man with a large mouth, and the situation was manageable. His heart rate was up because of the words "my wife's name" and the thing that had moved through him when Casero said she's settling in. The quick, involuntary flash of something he refused to call what it actually was. He called Dominic. "I need everything she's done," he said. "The foundations, the organizations, everything she was involved with. I want the names of the people she worked with, what she funded, what she built, all of it." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because I don't know," Raphael said. "And I should." Another pause, then, "I'll have it by morning." What Dominic delivered was 43 pages. Printed, organized chronologically, assembled with the efficiency of someone who had good researchers and a reason to be thorough. Raphael read it over 2 days. He read it the way he read operational briefs, systematically, going back over sections, annotating in the margins. By the end, his handwriting was dense on every page. She had started the legal aid organization 18 months before they were married. She had been running it while attending every event, every obligation, every function that the Moretti name required her to appear at, without once mentioning it in a way that made it real to him. She had had lunch with him the day after they broke ground on the organization's new office space, and he had talked about the Red Hook situation the entire time, and she had listened and said the right things and asked a few precise questions, and he had thought, if he had thought anything, that she was a good listener. She was a good listener. She was also someone who had been building something extraordinary and had simply stopped expecting him to notice. On a Tuesday, 3 weeks after she had left, Raphael drove to the brownstone on Marlborough Street. He told himself he was not going to knock on her door. He told himself this several times on the drive up. He told Marco to park a block away, and he walked to the building and stood on the opposite side of the street and looked up at the windows, which were lit on the third floor, warm and yellow through the glass. He stood there for 12 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch twice. He didn't knock. He went back to the car and told Marco to drive, and he sat in the back seat with the city going past outside and the particular futility of a man who has driven 4 hours to stand on a sidewalk and do nothing pressing on him from all sides. "Where to?" Marco said. Raphael looked at his hands. "Back," he said. "New York." He was halfway back when his phone lit up. Not a call. A text from a number he didn't recognize. But the message made it clear enough who it was from, because only 4 people in the world had this phone number, and one of them had just walked away. The text said, "I know you were on my street tonight. Don't come back unless you have something real to say." He read it 3 times. He started typing 3 different replies and erased all 3 of them. He stared at the words until the screen went dark. He thought about real. The specific weight of the word as she had deployed it. Not dramatic, not accusatory. Simply a standard, a requirement. The same precision she brought to everything else, apparently, because that was who she was. That was the woman he had spent 3 years failing to see. Someone who operated at a level of clarity he hadn't credited her with because he had never looked long enough to see it. Don't come back unless you have something real to say. He didn't have it yet. He knew that. The 43 pages didn't give it to him, and the 12 minutes on the sidewalk didn't give it to him, and the sleepless nights and the coffee he kept not drinking and the drawer with the bracelet in it. None of it was the thing she was asking for. She wasn't asking for remorse. She could probably see remorse coming from him and not be impressed by it, because she was someone who dealt in substance, who had spent 3 years watching him confuse motion for meaning and presence for care. What she was asking for was transformation, the real kind, the kind that required him to dismantle something fundamental about the man he had built himself into. And he was 41 years old and had been building that man for 20 years. And the demolition she was asking for was not something he knew how to begin. But what kept him awake that night, and the next, and the one after, was the specific, quiet certainty settling in him like weight, like ballast, like something finding its correct place after a very long time in the wrong one. He wanted to try, not because of what he had lost, not even because of who she was, though who she was had become clearer to him in 3 weeks of reading her history than it had been in 3 years of living beside her. He wanted to try because of what he had seen in himself, laid out in 43 pages and 12 minutes on a sidewalk and a phone screen going dark. The portrait of a man who had mistaken control for connection his entire life and had never once been asked to reckon with the difference. She had asked him to reckon with it in leaving, in the envelope. In one text message containing 11 words that hit harder than anything anyone had ever said to him in 20 years of operating in a world where the currency was force. He put his phone face down on his nightstand. He looked at the ceiling of the penthouse, which was high and white, and said nothing. Somewhere in Boston, the woman he had called nothing more was beginning a life without him. And in the eastern offices of a man named Carver Doyle, a man Raphael knew only by reputation, a real estate developer with connections to 3 of the same charity circuits Vivian had been involved in, a man who had, in the last 3 weeks, contacted the legal aid organization Vivian had founded twice and offered a substantial donation in person. Something was being set in motion that Raphael didn't know about yet. He would find out, the way he always found out about things that were moving in the world around him, because he had eyes everywhere and information was the one currency he had never stopped accumulating. What he didn't know yet, what would change everything when he did, was that Carver Doyle's interest in Vivian Ashcroft was not entirely philanthropic, and that Vivian, who had spent 3 years being invisible, was about to become very, very visible to the wrong. The information about Carver Doyle arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered the way all useful information arrived in Raphael's world, not through official channels, not through anything that could be subpoenaed or traced, but through a phone call from a man named Stein, who worked out of a basement office in Flushing and had, over 14 years, proven himself to be the most reliable private intelligence source Raphael had ever paid for. Stein didn't editorialize. That was his value. He delivered facts in the flat, sequential manner of someone reading a grocery list, and he let the facts do whatever they were going to do to the person receiving them. Carver Doyle, Stein said. 54. Real estate development, commercial and mixed use, primarily Boston and Providence. Clean public record. 3 LLCs, 2 of which are legitimate, one of which routes money from a source I've only partially traced. It terminates in an account in Luxembourg that was opened 18 months ago. Prior to the real estate work, he spent 8 years in financial services. He left under circumstances that weren't disclosed publicly, but the firm he left had a compliance investigation the following year that was settled quietly. Raphael was standing at his desk. He hadn't sat down since the call started. Vivian. He attended 2 events her foundation organized in the last 6 weeks, made a personal donation of $60,000 to the legal aid organization, requested a private meeting with the executive director. That's not her. That's a woman named Kim. But Kim told him the founding board member handles major donor relationships personally. Vivian handles major donor relationships personally, Raphael said. Correct. They've had 1 meeting. Coffee, Cambridge, last Thursday. My source is secondhand on this. I don't have direct surveillance. Why is he interested in her foundation? Stein paused. The pause of a man who has something to say and is choosing his words. That's where it gets complicated. The Luxembourg account, the partial trace I have, it connects to a holding company that has a legal dispute pending with the city of Providence. Zoning issue on a waterfront development. The dispute has been stalled at the administrative level for 14 months. Raphael's jaw tightened. He already saw the shape of it before Stein said it. Your wife's legal aid organization, Stein said, has a sister nonprofit in Providence that does housing advocacy. 2 of their attorneys have been involved as public commenters on the zoning case. Their position has slowed Doyle's project significantly. He wants her to pull the advocacy. That's my read, yes. And he's building a relationship with her to do it. She doesn't know what he is, Stein said. Everything she would see is a wealthy donor with a genuine interest in legal aid for women. His public profile is clean. His charitable giving is documented. He's been doing this, cultivating credibility in exactly these circles, for at least 2 years. Raphael sat down. He set his phone on his desk and put it on speaker and pressed his palms flat against the desk surface, the way he did when he was working to keep something internal very still. Is she in danger? He said. Not a question, a calibration request. Physical danger. Not that I can assess, he's not that kind of operator. But if he's planning to leverage the relationship, if he gets close enough to her that she considers his interests, or worse, if he finds something he can use as pressure. Stein stopped. She doesn't know who she's sitting across from. That's the exposure. She's not going to pull the advocacy, Raphael said. That's not who she is. No, Stein agreed, which is when it stops being a persuasion problem and becomes something else. Raphael picked the phone back up, took it off speaker. Keep tracing the Luxembourg account. I want daily updates on his contact with anything connected to her. Understood. A pause. How do you want to handle the contact itself? Raphael thought about 11 words on a dark phone screen. Don't come back unless you have something real to say. Not yet, he said, but stay close. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark with the information moving through him and tried to separate the 2 things that were braided together in his chest and refusing to be distinguished from each other. The operational concern, which was real and legitimate, and the kind of thing he was equipped to handle, and the other thing, the thing underneath it, which was the image of Vivian sitting across a table from Carver Doyle in Cambridge, drinking coffee, seeing a philanthropist with a clean smile and genuine seeming interest, not knowing that the interest had a blueprint behind it. She was smart. He knew that now with a specificity he hadn't had before. The 43 pages had made that clear. She was rigorous and strategic, and she read people with a precision that most people in her position didn't develop because they never needed to. But even smart people got taken in when the presentation was built carefully enough. Doyle had been building his for 2 years. The thing that kept moving through Raphael, cycling back with a persistence he couldn't metabolize, was this. She had left a world where she was protected because that world had also made her invisible. She had traded the protection for the visibility, for the selfhood, for the life she was now building on Marlborough Street with the warm yellow windows. And now the visibility had attracted something she hadn't accounted for, and the protection was no longer in place, and he was 41 miles away in a penthouse she had walked out of, and he had no right, no formal, recognized, accepted right to do anything about it. He had signed the papers. Gerald had processed them. The marriage was in its legal dying days, winding down through the administrative requirements that converted a human failure into a documented one. He was almost not her husband. He was certainly not her protector, not in any way she had agreed to. He called Stein at 4 in the morning and said, "Put someone on her." Passive. "She can't know." He paused. "She would never accept it if she knew." "Understood." "Nothing intrusive. I just want eyes." "Done." He hung up and lay back down and stared at the ceiling and felt the specific wrongness of the position he was in, acting without consent, making decisions about her safety that she would reject if given the chance to reject them, reproducing in miniature the exact dynamic that had made her leave in the first place. He knew this. He was not oblivious to the contradiction. He did it anyway because the alternative was doing nothing, and he had already spent 3 years doing nothing, and look where that had ended. Vivian met with Carver Doyle for the second time on a Friday afternoon at the Foundation's offices in the South End. He arrived 7 minutes early, which she noted. People who arrive early to meetings with nonprofits are usually trying to demonstrate respect, and the demonstration itself is information. He was tall, well-dressed in the way of someone who spent money on clothes without appearing to think about it, with a face that had the practiced openness of someone who had learned that openness was disarming. He was disarming. She registered this without being disarmed by it, which was a distinction she had learned to make working in spaces where wealthy donors sometimes confused generosity with leverage. "I've been going through your annual reports," he said, after the initial exchange. He had a folder, actual paper, which surprised her. Most donors her age worked from tablets. "The Providence Initiative is impressive, the housing advocacy work." "Kim can tell you more about the Providence work specifically," Vivian said. "That program has its own director." "I know. I've read her bio." He smiled. "I wanted to talk to you about the larger picture, the organizational strategy, where you see the mission going in the next 5 years." It was the right question. It was a very specifically right question, the kind that signaled genuine engagement rather than transactional interest, and it opened a conversation she found herself actually having rather than performing. He listened well. He asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he had retained what she said. He had opinions about legal aid funding that were informed and not irritating. She walked out of the meeting with a check for $120,000 and a feeling she examined carefully on the way down the stairs. Something that was almost uncomplicated, almost just the straightforward satisfaction of a productive donor meeting. Almost. There was a thread of something else, something she couldn't locate precisely. Not alarm, not yet. More like the faint dissonance of a note that's almost right. She filed it. She was good at filing things she didn't yet have context for. Raphael got the report from Stein on a Monday. His man had been following the thread of the Luxembourg account and had gotten further than expected, which meant he had gotten to something Stein described as problematic, which in Stein's vocabulary meant something considerably worse than problematic. The account didn't just connect to the Providence development, it connected to 2 other holding companies, one of which had a documented relationship with a man named Prescott, who ran a mid-level loan operation in the Boston financial district that supplemented its legitimate business with a sideline in financial coercion, leveraging personal debt, manufactured or real, to compel compliance from individuals who had something Prescott's clients wanted. "Doyle has used Prescott before," Stein said. "I have confirmation on 2 prior cases. Both involved individuals who had legal or political influence over projects Doyle needed moved. In both cases, Prescott's people found something, financial irregularity, personal history, a vulnerability, and applied pressure." "What kind of pressure?" "The effective kind." A pause. "In one case, the individual involved resigned from their position. In the other case, they changed their public position on the relevant matter. Neither case was ever reported, as far as I can find." Raphael was very still. "He's not just trying to cultivate her, he's building a file." "That's my read. If persuasion doesn't work, if she won't pull the advocacy voluntarily, He has someone who can find a pressure point. She doesn't have pressure points. He said it with the certainty of someone who had, in the last 3 weeks, read 43 pages about a woman's life and found nothing in it that could be called a vulnerability. Her finances are clean. Her personal history is... It doesn't have to be real, Stein said quietly. That's the thing with Prescott. Sometimes it's manufactured. The word sat in the air. Manufactured. Raphael thought about what that meant in practice. What a man like Prescott could construct, given resources and motivation, around a woman who had just left a marriage to one of New York's most visible organized crime figures. The material available, the narrative that could be built from it. A woman who had lived in that proximity for 3 years, whose name was in the same sentence as Raphael Moretti's on any number of documents, whose departure had been recent enough that the details were still unsettled. He thought about what a manufactured vulnerability would do to the legal aid organization she had built, to the foundation, to the work she had been doing in the margins of his life while he wasn't looking, and was now doing in the full light of her own. His hands were flat on his desk. He was aware of them, aware of the pressure he was putting into the surface. When, he said, my assessment, he'll make one more move personally, one more meeting, something that lets him gauge where she is. If she's not movable, he activates Prescott within 30 days. 30 days? Outside estimate. Raphael stood, he walked to the window. The city was doing the city thing. Indifferent, enormous, continuing. He had a decision to make, and he knew exactly what it was, and he also knew that making it would cost him something significant, possibly the only real currency he had left in this particular situation. I need to tell her, he said. Stein said nothing. If I tell her, she's going to know I had someone watching her. He said it out loud because sometimes the truth required air. She's going to know I've been running surveillance on her life since she left. Yes, Stein said. She's going to be furious. Probably. She might not believe me. She might think it's a manipulation, a way to get back in. Stein, to his credit, did not offer false reassurance. That's possible. Raphael pressed 2 fingers against his temple. The headache behind his eyes had been constant for a week. He breathed slowly, the way he'd learned to breathe in situations where the right decision was the costly one, where the correct action came with damage attached that he had to absorb anyway. He had spent 3 years making decisions about her life, what she attended, how she presented, what was required of her, what was expected, without her input, without her knowledge, without caring enough to ask. He had made her invisible by the accumulation of his indifference, and what he was standing here contemplating was, in its structure, not dissimilar, a decision about her safety made without her consent. Except the difference was the direction of the cost. Before, the cost had always landed on her. He had decided, and she had paid. Now the cost would land on him. He would tell her, and she would be angry, and she might not believe him, and he would absorb that, and he would be transparent about what he'd done and why, and she would decide what to do with the information. That was the difference. He would give her the information and the choice. That was all he could do. I'm going to Boston, he said. Stein said nothing for a moment, then, do you want backup? No. Raphael, no, he said. Not for this. He called Marco. He said, pack for one night. We leave in an hour. He hung up and stood at the window for a moment longer, looking at the city, thinking about the version of himself that had stood in a hotel corridor 3 years ago and said to 2 men whose opinions he valued, she's my wife on paper, nothing more. The ease of it, the boredom of it, the way the words had required nothing from him, no thought, no consideration, no recognition that the person they described was, in fact, a person. He thought about what it would cost him to walk to a door on Marlborough Street and knock on it. Not the emotional cost. He had made a kind of reckoning with that. But the tactical cost. The admission it represented. He had spent his entire adult life in a world where showing up without leverage, without a position of strength, without the upper hand in some structural way, was a form of exposure that could be exploited. He was about to show up with nothing, no leverage, no position, just the truth, which was that he had failed her in every way that mattered and had then compounded the failure by having someone watch her without her knowledge, and that in spite of all of that, In spite of having no right to any claim on her attention or her safety, he was here because a man with bad intentions was maneuvering around her, and he could not make himself do nothing about it. The truth was not a strong position. He was going anyway. Shut. He knocked on her door at 6:15 in the evening. The light was going amber and low over the rooftops of the back bay. The kind of Boston evening that was cold without being hostile. The sky doing something complicated in shades of gray and orange. He had dismissed Marco 2 blocks away. He stood on the brownstone's front steps and knocked and waited. She opened the door in the way of someone who was not expecting anyone. No coat, no bag, the look of a person inside their own evening. She was wearing a dark sweater and her hair was down, and she looked in the specific and undeniable way of someone occupying a space that fit them at home. She looked at him. The expression on her face moved through several things quickly. Surprise, then something that closed up fast, then a steadiness that he recognized as her default mode and had once mistaken for coldness. "I told you not to come back," she said, without something real to say. "I know." He met her eyes. "I have something real to say, and you're not going to like any of it." Her hand was still on the door. She looked at him for a long moment. Reading him, he realized, the way she probably read everyone, with that quiet precision he had never bothered to notice she had. He let her look. He didn't arrange his face into anything useful. He stood there the way he was, which was tired and uncertain and without a single card to play, and let her read whatever she could find. She stepped back from the door. "Then you'd better come in," she said. He walked through the door of the life she had built without him, and he told her everything. The surveillance, Stein, Doyle, the Luxembourg account, Prescott, the 30-day window. And he watched her face as he did it, and what he saw there was not what he expected. Not fury, not immediately. First, something that was almost worse. A stillness that had calculation in it, the stillness of someone who has just received information that changes the architecture of several decisions they thought were already made. When he finished, the room was quiet. The apartment was warm. Somewhere outside, a car passed. "You had someone watching me," she said. "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." The word sat there. No qualifier, no justification, just yes. She looked at him, and he saw it begin, the anger, real and clean and entirely earned, rising in her face. "You had no right." "No," he said. "I didn't." The agreement seemed to stop her for a fraction of a second. She had been prepared for defense. She absorbed the absence of it. "And you're telling me now," she said. "Why?" "Because you need to know about Doyle." He paused. "And because you deserve to be angry at me for the right reasons, with complete information." She was quiet for a very long time. Outside, another car. The building settling. The specific silence of a room where two people are both working very hard. "If what you're telling me about Doyle is true," she said finally, "then the Providence advocacy work is the target. And if Prescott is involved..." She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "One of the attorneys on that case is a woman named Adriana Reyes. She's 26 years old. She came to us through the scholarship program. This is her first major case." She stood up from the couch. She went to the window. She stood there with her back to him, and he could see in the line of her shoulders the particular weight of someone recalculating something they had built with care. "She's the one who's exposed," Vivian said. "Not me. If Prescott goes looking for pressure points, he goes for Adriana. She's young. She doesn't have..." Her voice caught once, briefly. She trusted this organization to protect her. Raphael watched her. He watched the moment she went from anger, the personal anger, entirely about him, to something beyond it. The shift was visible. It moved through her like a current finding its direction. She turned. "What do you actually know about Prescott's operation?" she said. "Specifically." And Raphael Moretti, who had spent 3 years overlooking the woman standing across from him, understood in this moment with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that he was not looking at someone who needed his protection. He was looking at someone who was about to become a problem for Carver Doyle and everyone connected to him, and who was asking him for information not because she was frightened, but because she was already thinking 3 moves ahead. "Tell me everything," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who had already decided what they were going to do and was simply acquiring the tools to do. She made him sit down. That was the first thing. She pointed at the chair across from the couch, with the kind of authority that didn't require volume, and he sat because there was nothing else to do when someone occupying their own space with complete clarity pointed at a chair. She brought a legal pad from the kitchen counter. She sat across from him. She uncapped a pen. "Start with what you know about Prescott's methodology," she said. "Specifically, not generally." He looked at her for a moment. The legal pad, the pen, the expression of someone who had already converted her anger into fuel and was now running on it. He had expected a conversation. He had been prepared for the shape of a conversation. Her anger, his accountability, possibly her telling him to leave, possibly a door closing again in a different room. He had not been prepared for this, the immediate forward-facing operational quality of her. He told her what he knew: Stein's full report, the 2 prior cases, the profile on Prescott, the timeline. She wrote while he talked, not looking up, her handwriting small and fast and dense. She asked precise questions at precise moments, not to clarify his meaning, he realized, but to fill gaps she had identified faster than he could move through the material. When he finished, she looked at the pad for a moment. "Adriana's background," she said. "There's nothing there. I know this because we did our own vetting before she came on. Her finances are clean. Her personal history is clean. She came out of a difficult family situation in Bridgeport, but there's nothing that Prescott could construct into—" She stopped. Her pen was moving in a small, unconscious circle on the edge of the page. "Unless he doesn't use her history. Unless he manufactures something current." Current how? A financial irregularity. Something that looks like misappropriation. She handles some of the grant disbursements for the Providence program. She looked up. "If someone planted something in those records, can he get access to your records?" Not through the organization, but Doyle's 3rd meeting request. He wanted a tour of the office. "Kim told me last week. I hadn't scheduled it yet." She set the pen down. "If he got into the building." Raphael's jaw was tight. When was Kim's conversation with him? 4 days ago. He pulled out his phone. He called Stein. The call connected on the 2nd ring. "Doyle's physical access to the South End office," Raphael said. "Has he been inside the building?" A pause. Keyboard sounds. "No record of an official visit. Let me check something." Another pause, longer. "There's a gap in my coverage from last Thursday. 6-hour window. I had a source issue. I flagged it in the report but didn't have a fill." "Last Thursday," Vivian said, and her voice had changed, flattened. "Last Thursday, Kim had a vendor come in for a security system quote. She mentioned it was a referral from one of the board members." "Which board member?" She was already reaching for her phone. She pulled up a contact, called, waited. Raphael watched her face while it rang. Her jaw was set. Her free hand was flat on her knee, perfectly still, the stillness of someone keeping something contained through deliberate effort. "Kim." Her voice was easy, practiced. No alarm in it at all. "Hey, the security vendor from last Thursday, do you still have the company name? I'm just following up on something for the annual report." A pause. She listened. Her face didn't change, but something moved through it, a tightening around the eyes. "Okay, thanks." She hung up. She looked at Raphael. "The referral came from the board member's assistant," she said, "not from the board member directly. Kim thought it was unusual enough to note at the time and then forgot about it because the vendor was professional and the quote was reasonable." She paused. "Kim didn't let them into the financial records room, but she left them unsupervised in the main office for 11 minutes while she took a call." 11 minutes! Raphael was already doing the calculation. 11 minutes for someone who knew what they were doing was more than sufficient. He called Stein back. "I need a forensic IT person in the South End tonight. I need to know if anything in that organization's financial records has been touched, added, or altered in the last 7 days." "I can have someone there in 2 hours," Stein said. Raphael looked at Vivian. She nodded, already pulling up Kim's number again to arrange access. The next 2 hours had the quality of a clock winding down. Not countdown to relief, but countdown to something that could go multiple ways, none of them clean. Vivian called Kim and gave her a version of the truth. A concern about a potential security breach. A need for a quiet audit. Please don't mention it to anyone in or connected to the board. Kim, who was apparently the kind of person who processed alarming information by immediately becoming useful, Said she would be there in 30 minutes. Vivienne put her phone on the coffee table and looked at Raphael. You should know, she said, and her voice had shifted slightly. Still controlled, but the control was doing more work now. That I'm furious about the surveillance. What you did, I know. Don't interrupt me. The words were quiet, level, more effective than volume. What you did was exactly the thing I left to get away from. You making decisions about my life without my knowledge. You deciding what I need and acting on it without asking. She held his gaze. I understand why you did it. That's not the same as it being acceptable. He said nothing. He had learned in the last 4 weeks that there were moments where words were a way of not listening, and this was one of them. When this is over, she said, we're going to have a full conversation about what your involvement in my life looks like going forward, if it looks like anything at all. She picked up the legal pad. Right now, we have a different problem. Agreed. I lead on the response. This is my organization, my people, my attorney's exposure. You provide information and resources. You don't make unilateral calls. He looked at her. 3 years of marriage, and he had never heard her say the word unilateral. He had never heard her say most of what she'd said in the last hour, because he had never given her the space in which to say it, and the specific loss of that, the years of not knowing the voice she used when she was angry and certain and fully herself, landed on him now like something physical. Agreed, he said. Stein's IT contact arrived at the South End office at 8:45. Her name was Park. No first name offered, which Raphael understood was a professional preference he didn't need to challenge, and she worked with the quiet focus of someone in complete command of her environment. Vivian and Kim sat in the conference room while Park worked. Raphael stood in the hallway. He stood there for an hour and a quarter. He was not a man accustomed to hallways. He was not accustomed to the periphery of things, to waiting outside rooms where decisions were being made. He stood there and absorbed it, and didn't reach for his phone, didn't call anyone, didn't manufacture something productive to do. He stood in the hallway of a nonprofit office in the South End of Boston at 9:30 at night and waited. And the specific humility of it was something he recognized he needed to sit in without reaching for an exit. Park came out at 10:05. It's there, she said. She had a laptop with her, open to something Raphael couldn't see clearly. Embedded in the grant disbursement records. It's subtle. Whoever did it knew the system well enough to mimic the formatting. On first pass, it looks like a duplicate payment, about $14,000, routed to an account that doesn't appear in any legitimate vendor documentation. She looked at him steadily. If someone pulled these records cold and didn't know what they were looking at, they'd see financial mismanagement at minimum. Depending on how they framed it, possibly misappropriation. Did they Can you document it as a plant? The metadata is off. Whoever inserted it used a timestamp that doesn't match the server logs. She closed the laptop. It's documentable, is fraudulent. Yes. How long to prepare that documentation? In a form that would hold up legally? 2 days. Maybe 3. He went into the conference room. Vivian was at the table, both hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. Kim was beside her, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who had been handed information that has changed the texture of the room they thought they were in. It's there, Raphael said. Vivian nodded. She had known. She'd known before Park came in. He could tell by the quality of the stillness she was sitting in. Not waiting for information, but waiting for confirmation of information she had already processed. 3 days to document it properly, he said. I know a federal attorney, she said. We worked together on a housing case 2 years ago. She handles financial fraud. She looked up. If I go to her first thing tomorrow, we can have a conversation about how to structure this before Prescott moves. Doyle doesn't know we know, Raphael said. That's the window. It's a narrow window. It's enough. She looked at him. Something in the look that wasn't warm, exactly, but was direct in a way that felt like its own kind of contact. You need to stay out of this part, she said. I'm not walking into a federal attorney's office with Raphael Moretti's involvement in the background. That's a different story than the one I need to tell. He absorbed that. The truth of it. I'll be available for technical information, off the record, whatever Stein has. Through your attorney, not directly. Through Gerald? Yes. She stood. She picked up the legal pad, looked at it once, put it in her bag. She looked at Kim. I need you to act normally tomorrow. Nothing about this to the board, nothing to any of the staff. Can you do that? Kim, to her credit, said yes, with the certainty of someone who meant it. Vivian looked at Raphael. You need to go back to New York. He looked at her. He had not expected the dismissal, though he should have. Vivian, you've told me what you came to tell me, she said. You've provided the resources I need for tonight. The next steps are mine. A pause. If I need something from your end, I'll contact you through Gerald. He stood there for a moment. The conference room was fluorescent and neutral, the kind of room designed for practicality rather than comfort, and she stood in it with the legal pad in her bag and the particular composure of someone who had been through something significant and had converted it without ceremony into forward momentum. He wanted to say something. He had a long list of things he had wanted to say since the night she walked out of the penthouse elevator, and standing in this conference room was not the moment for any of them. She had told him that clearly without saying it, and he was trying, in the ways available to him, to hear things that weren't said. Okay, he said. He left. The next 72 hours were the longest of his life, which was a statement that had real competition. He was in New York. She was in Boston. He knew what was happening, not through Stein, whom he had pulled back from active monitoring as a gesture he wasn't sure she would ever know about or credit, but through Gerald, who was in contact with Vivian's federal attorney connection, a woman named Hartwell, who had the reputation of someone who moved fast and didn't leak. He knew the documentation was being prepared. He knew Hartwell had reviewed Park's technical findings and called them, in Gerald's paraphrase, extremely actionable. He knew a meeting had been scheduled. What he didn't know was the variable he couldn't control, which was Doyle's timeline. Stein had said 30 days outside estimate. They were at day 19 since Doyle's last contact with Vivian. The window was narrowing. On day 21, Doyle called Vivian directly. Raphael learned about the call from Gerald that evening. Vivian had reported it to Hartwell, who had told Gerald, who called Raphael with a neutrality he didn't bother disguising as anything. Doyle had requested another meeting. He had been, by Vivian's account, warm, but with a pressure underneath the warmth, the particular pressure of someone moving toward a deadline they hadn't disclosed. He wanted to discuss the Providence program specifically. He had framed it as wanting to understand the advocacy strategy, the legal approach. She had agreed to meet him. Friday. A restaurant in Cambridge she had chosen herself, but public, familiar, her territory. Raphael sat with that information for 4 hours. He sat with it in his home office, with the door closed and the city doing its city thing outside, and he sat with the pull he felt toward action, the reflex, deep and practiced, to reach for the phone and call someone and deploy something and control the variable. He sat with it until he could feel the shape of it clearly, could feel exactly where it came from and what it was made of. Then he didn't call anyone. He let it go. He sat in his office and he let Vivian Ashcroft handle her own life. And it cost him something, and he paid it. And he sat there afterward in the space it left. Whoa. The Friday meeting happened, and then 20 minutes after it ended, Gerald called. She's fine, Gerald said before Raphael could say anything. Hartwell had a contact in the restaurant. Vivian wore a wire, Hartwell's, not ours. Doyle made the ask. He was careful about it, indirect, but he made it. He wants the Providence advocacy withdrawn. Vivian told him she needed to consult the board. She stalled him. She gave Hartwell everything she needed. The recording's clean. A pause. They're moving tonight. Hartwell has a federal contact who's been building a file on Prescott independently. Doyle's connection to Prescott links them. They're treating the planted record as evidence of a coordinated fraud scheme. Raphael's hand was tight on the phone. Adriana Reyes, the young attorney. Fully cleared. The plan has been documented as fraudulent by 3 independent technical reviews. There's no exposure. He exhaled. It was not a clean exhale, so there was still something in his chest that wouldn't quite release, something that would take more than this phone call to address. Gerald, he said. Yeah. How did she do? A silence. Gerald had known Raphael for 15 years and had never once been asked this particular category of question. She was... He stopped. Tried again. Hartwell described her as the most composed witness she's worked with in 11 years. Raphael closed his eyes, just for a moment. Thank you, he said. He sat in the quiet of his office for a long time after he hung up. The night was clear outside the windows. The city was lit up in the particular way of a Friday, bright and purposeful, full of people going toward something. He thought about Vivian in a restaurant in Cambridge with a wire under her clothes and Doyle across the table. And he thought about the composure Hartwell had described. And he thought about the 43 pages and the legal pad and the way she had pointed at the chair and told him to sit. He thought about what it had cost her to build everything she had built. Not money. She had access to money through the marriage, which was the only thing the marriage had delivered reliably. What it had cost her in the currency that actually mattered. Time, energy, the sustained effort of someone doing real work in the margins of a life that didn't make room for her to be fully visible. She had done it anyway, quietly, consistently, without requiring recognition from the one person who should have given it. He thought about what it meant that she had let him in the door. She had looked at him on her front step with his terrible timing and his bad history and the surveillance he had admitted to, and she had stepped back from the door and said, "You'd better come in." And he understood now, sitting with the quiet of what had just happened in a restaurant in Cambridge, that she had not let him in because she needed him. She had let him in because she had decided in that moment, with her precise, unsentimental way of making decisions, that the information he carried mattered more than the anger she had every right to sustain. That distinction between needing him and choosing, pragmatically, to use what he offered, was something he was only beginning to understand. In the old version of himself, the version that had built an empire on the logic of indispensability, he would have confused those two things, would have interpreted her opening the door as something it wasn't, would have taken it as an opening. He was trying not to be that version of himself. It was slow work. It felt like learning a language where all the words resembled other words you already knew, and the resemblance was the difficulty. His phone lit up. Not a call. A text. The same number as before. The one from the highway outside New Haven. The one that had sent 11 words that had kept him awake for weeks. This one said, "It worked. Hartwell says Doyle and Prescott are done. Adriana is safe." He looked at the message for a long time. He typed 3 things and deleted all of them. Finally, he typed, "I'm glad." And then, after a moment, because it was true and she deserved true things from him, however late they arrived, "You were remarkable." He watched the screen. 3 minutes passed. He put the phone face down on his desk and told himself it was fine, that the text was enough, that he didn't need a response to know what mattered. Then the phone lit up again. He picked it up. The message said, "I know." And then, below it, a second message, arriving as he read the first. It said, "Come to Boston on the 15th. There's an event. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking you to show up." There's a difference. He read it twice. He read it the way he had been reading everything lately, carefully, attending to what the words actually said rather than what he wanted them to mean. There's a difference. There was a difference. He knew that. He was learning what the difference felt like from the inside, which was harder than knowing it abstractly, which was the only way he had known most things for most of his life. He typed back, "I'll be there. No bodyguards, no team, just me." He set the phone down. He looked at the window. The city was still out there, enormous and indifferent and lit up in all its Friday urgency. And in 4 weeks it would be the 15th, and he would drive to Boston, and he would stand in whatever room she was standing in, and he would be a man who had spent 4 months learning something he should have known before he ever said the words, "Nothing more." And it wouldn't be enough. He knew it wouldn't be enough. Not on its own. Not yet. But it would be something real. For the first time since she handed him an envelope on their anniversary, Raphael Moretti felt something in his chest that was not loss, not guilt, not the cold, familiar weight of a failure being inventoried. It was small. It was fragile in the way of things that are beginning rather than ending. It was the first thing in a very long time that was pointing forward instead of back. Outside, the city moved. Inside, a man sat at his desk and thought about what it meant to show up. Not as a mafia boss, not as a husband on paper, not as someone with power and leverage and all the institutional architecture of a life built to control outcomes, but simply as a man who had finally, too late and not too late, begun to understand the difference between commanding a room and deserving to be in. The 15th arrived the way significant days usually do, without fanfare, without the weather cooperating with the occasion, without any of the atmospheric accommodation that the human need for meaning tends to project onto calendar dates. It was a Tuesday in April, cold in the particular way that Boston stays cold past the point where it's welcome, the sky the color of old concrete. The trees along Marlborough Street still in that stubborn pre-bloom state, where the branches held the suggestion of leaves without committing to them. Raphael left New York at 7 in the morning. He drove himself, which he hadn't done in years, not because Marco was unavailable, but because the drive was something he wanted to do alone, in the specific way that certain things need to be arrived at under your own power to mean what you need them to mean. He took the I-95 north, and he didn't play music, and he didn't make calls, and he drove through Connecticut in the gray morning light, thinking about nothing he could have articulated and everything that mattered. He had spent the 4 weeks since Vivian's text doing the thing she had implicitly asked him to do, which was not the thing he would have done naturally, which was to strategize. What he had done instead was something more uncomfortable and less mappable. He had talked to people, not associates, not attorneys, not the professionals of his world, whose job was to interface with his decisions. He had called his younger sister Elena, who lived in Philadelphia, and had told him 6 years ago, when he married Vivian, that she hoped he understood what he was asking of someone, and who had said nothing further on the subject until he called her in March and said he needed to talk. He had driven to Philadelphia on a Saturday and sat in her kitchen for 4 hours, and Elena, who was 43 and had 2 children and a husband, she had chosen carefully and a way of listening that reminded him now, painfully, of Vivian, had told him things he needed to hear in the way that only someone who has loved you your entire life can tell you things, which is without mercy and without cruelty, in the plain language of someone who has nothing to prove. He had also, quietly and without announcement, begun the process of extracting himself from certain parts of the organization. Not everything, that was the work of years, not months, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But the parts that were the most exposed, the most indefensible, the parts that had always carried the weight of a choice he had made at 22, when he was too young to fully understand what he was choosing. He had called Gerald and had a conversation that Gerald described afterward, to no one, as the most surprising professional exchange of his career. He had begun a process that had no clean ending but had at least a direction. He didn't do these things for Vivian. That was important, and he was clear-eyed about it in the way that Elena had helped him be clear-eyed. Doing them for her would be another version of the same pattern, another way of making her the organizing principle of his choices rather than himself. He did them because when he had sat on the floor of the penthouse in March and asked himself who he was, the answer had been insufficient, and he had decided, quietly, without ceremony, the way Vivian did everything. That insufficiency was no longer acceptable. Whether she wanted anything to do with the man he was becoming was her decision. He had driven 4 hours to be available for that decision. Whatever she made of him was hers to make. The event was held at the Harborview Center, a glass and steel building on the waterfront that the city used for civic functions and fundraisers of a certain scale. Vivian's foundation had organized the evening, an annual celebration of the legal aid organization's scholarship recipients, the women who had come through the program and gone on to pass the bar, to take cases, to become the practitioners of the work the organization existed to support. Raphael arrived at 6:40, 20 minutes before the program started. He stood in the lobby and felt, with considerable clarity, entirely out of his element. He was not in his element in rooms that ran on sincerity. He had built his life in rooms that ran on power, on the careful management of information and leverage, and the particular grammar of men who understood that everything was a negotiation. This room ran on something different, and he was aware of the difference in his body, in the slight stiffness of someone who doesn't know the local customs. He saw Kim first, Vivian's executive director, who recognized him with an expression that cycled through several responses before landing on professional composure. She said, "Hello." He said, "Hello." The exchange was brief and honest in its awkwardness. Vivian came through a side door at 6:50, carrying a folder and talking to a young woman he didn't recognize, late 20s, dark hair, the animated expression of someone discussing something that mattered to her. He understood, from context and from the folder, and from the way Vivian was listening with that complete attending quality he now recognized as her, at full presence, that this was Adriana Reyes. He stayed where he was. He watched Vivian listen to the young attorney, watched her nod, watched her say something that made Adriana laugh briefly, and then settle into something more serious, some piece of counsel or reassurance, or both. He watched her be, for a few minutes, entirely herself in a room full of people she had built something with, and he felt the weight of the 4 weeks settle into something he couldn't quite name. Not regret exactly, because regret pointed backward, and what he was feeling pointed in a different direction. Something closer to understanding. The specific, arrived-at understanding of someone who has finally, through significant cost, learned to see clearly. She noticed him at 6:55. The room had been filling up and he was standing near the back, which was deliberate, and she was scanning the room the way event organizers scan rooms, cataloging attendance, checking against some internal list. Her eyes found him and stopped. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. Across the room, through the movement of people and the ambient noise of a gathering, that was all. A look. He didn't move toward her. He had told her he would show up. He had shown up. The rest was hers. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back to Adriana and finished her conversation. She walked toward him when it ended. She stopped 2 feet away. She was wearing something dark, simple, the same quality of understatement she always chose. She looked tired in the way of someone who had been through something significant and was on the functional side of it but hadn't fully rested yet. She also looked more herself than he had ever seen her look in 3 years of being her husband, and the coexistence of those two things, the tiredness and the selfhood, was something he sat with without trying to resolve. "You're here," she said. "I said I would be." She nodded, not acknowledging the statement, processing it. "How long have you been standing in the back?" "About 15 minutes. "You could have found me." "You were working." She looked at him. Something in the look shifted, not softening, but changing texture, recalibrating. "You drove yourself?" "Yes." "No Marco?" "No." She was quiet for a moment. "The program starts in 5 minutes, she said. "There's a seat at the back table if you want to stay." "I'd like to stay." She nodded again. She looked like she was going to say something else, then didn't, and walked back toward the front of the room, and he went to the back table and sat down. Book. The program lasted 90 minutes. Raphael sat through all of it. He was not a man who sat through programs. Events in his world were either working situations, rooms you moved through, conversations you extracted value from, appearances you made and departed, or they were obligations you endured. He sat through 90 minutes of this one, and it was neither of those things. And the reason was the content, which he had not anticipated finding arresting, and did. 7 women spoke. They were the scholarship recipients from the last 3 years, attorneys now, or nearly attorneys, working in housing law and immigration and domestic violence advocacy and a dozen other areas that he had always understood existed abstractly and now understood differently, listening to the specific details of specific cases in the voices of the women who had carried them. One of them had represented 43 families facing wrongful eviction in a single building in Dorchester over the course of 18 months. One of them had spent a year working a single immigration case that had eventually, in her words, not failed, which she explained was the way you described success in immigration work when the bar was set by what was actually at stake. Adriana Reyes spoke last. She was 26 years old and had been practicing for 8 months, and she spoke without notes and without performance, in the direct, unsentimental way of someone who had looked at difficult things directly and found they did not require ornamentation. She talked about the Providence case, carefully, without specific details that were still legally sensitive, but with enough to convey what it had been. She talked about the moment when she had understood that the case was being targeted. She talked about what it had felt like to have the organization stand behind her, to have the founding board member fly to Providence twice during the critical weeks, to have legal support and institutional backing, and the particular security of knowing that someone had built something capable of protecting the people inside it. She said, toward the end, something that Raphael would carry out of that room and not put down. The work doesn't protect itself. It needs people who decide over and over that protecting it is worth the cost. I used to think that was idealism. I've learned it's just a choice. You make it or you don't. The room was quiet for a moment after she stopped. Then it wasn't. Raphael sat at the back table and looked at his hands and thought about the choice. The specific, repeatable, undramatic choice that Vivian had been making for years in the margins of a life he had occupied the center of without recognizing what was happening around him. The formal program ended at 8:30, and the room shifted into the reception configuration, people moving and gathering, and the ambient noise rising to the comfortable level of a crowd at ease with itself. Raphael stayed at the back table. He was not, in this room, someone with natural social traction. He was an outsider here in the most complete sense, unknown to everyone, carrying a history that had nothing to do with what these people had built together. He sat with that and didn't reach for a way to manage it. Vivienne found him at 9. The room had thinned somewhat, the earlier energy settling into the longer conversations of people who were still there because they wanted to be. She sat down across from him, not beside him, across, which maintained a geometry of distance she apparently still needed and which he respected without comment. She had a glass of water. She set it on the table. She looked at him with the direct quality that was, he understood now, simply how she looked at things. Not confrontationally, but completely, without the partial attention that characterized most human looking. "Adriana's good," he said. "She's exceptional," Vivian said. "She doesn't know it yet. She will." He nodded, a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but that had weight in it, the weight of things waiting to be said that neither of them was rushing toward. "Doyle took a plea," she said. "Gerald probably told you." "He told me. Prescott's facing federal charges. The 2 prior cases Stein found, both individuals came forward once Hartwell's office contacted them." She looked at her water glass. "I didn't know about the prior cases when I agreed to wear the wire. Hartwell told me afterward. Does it change anything?" "No." She said it without hesitation. "I would have done it anyway." A pause. "It makes me angry that I didn't know sooner, that those 2 people had to absorb what he did to them without recourse. It sits badly." "It should," he said. She looked up at him, the look of someone checking something. "You pulled the surveillance," she said. He hadn't told her. "Yes." "When?" "The night you wore the wire, after Gerald called." She was quiet for a moment. Why? He thought about how to answer that honestly, not strategically, not in the way he would have framed something 3 months ago, but with the plain accuracy that she had established as the standard for their exchanges. "Because you didn't need it," he said, "and because maintaining it after you'd told me your terms was the old version of the thing, making decisions about your safety without your consent. I was done with that." She looked at him for a long time. The room moved around them. Someone laughed at a table nearby. "The organization in New York," she said. "The extraction Gerald mentioned." He had not expected this. Not yet. "You know about that?" "Gerald and Hartwell have been in contact. Hartwell mentioned it. She said it was—" She paused, choosing. She described it as a meaningful structural change. "It's a process," he said. It's not fast. It's not complete. I'm not going to tell you it's further along than it is. I'm not asking you to. It started because of what I saw in 43 pages, he said. Not because of what I was hoping for. I want to be clear about that." She tilted her head slightly, the gesture of someone giving a statement full consideration before responding to it. "Elena called me," she said. That landed. He hadn't known. "When?" 2 weeks ago. She wanted to know if I was all right." Vivian's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, something that lived near warmth. "She's a good person." "She is." "She didn't tell me what to do," Vivian said. "She didn't advocate for you. She just called to check." A pause. "I appreciated that." He nodded. She picked up her water glass. She looked at it, not at him, and he had the sense of someone approaching something carefully, not because they were afraid of it, but because they wanted to get to it accurately. "I've thought about what you said in my apartment," she said, "about the 43 pages, about not knowing." She set the glass down. "I want to say something about that, and I need you to hear it as true, not as an opening." "All right. I knew what I was entering," she said. "I was 29 years old, and I was not naive, and I understood the terms of the arrangement, and I accepted them. What I didn't understand, what I failed to account for, was that I would want it to be real. She said the word with a particular precision, as if she'd considered and rejected several other words first. That was my failure. Not accepting the terms. Wanting something that wasn't on offer and not addressing it directly for 3 years. He opened his mouth. "Let me finish," she said. Not unkindly, the way she said everything, clear and without performance. He closed his mouth. "I made myself invisible," she said. "Not only you. I did it too. I kept the foundation work separate, kept the advocacy separate, kept the parts of myself that were most real separate, because I had decided, Deacon, somewhere in the first year, that you wouldn't value them. I decided that before I tested it. And then I spent 2 more years confirming the assumption by never challenging it." She looked at him directly. "That's not an absolution. What you said at the gala was real. The way you saw me was real, and it was insufficient. I'm not arguing otherwise. I'm saying it was more complicated than one person doing something to another person." The room was quieter now. Most of the attendees had filtered out. The caterers were moving around the edges, beginning the quiet work of an event closing down. Raphael sat across from the woman he had been married to for 3 years and heard, for the first time, the complete version of a story he had only been given the edited outline of. And the complete version was harder than the outline in a different way. It required him to sit with his failure not as the clean story of a man who hadn't bothered, but as something more tangled. 2 people who had both, in their different ways, failed to bridge the distance between them. "I should have tried," he said. "Earlier, before the gala, before you had to hear that. I should have looked at you." "Yes," she said, simply. "I'm sorry." The words came out unadorned, without the careful architecture of a man used to constructing statements for effect. Just the 2 words. Not for the marriage ending, not for the arrangement falling apart. "I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I said what I said in that corridor. I'm sorry I spent 3 years taking it for granted that my indifference was consequence-free." The silence after that was different from the ones before it. It had a different texture, something in it that wasn't resolution but was its own thing, something that could potentially, given time and honesty and the consistent application of both, become the foundation of something real. Vivian looked at him. "I know," she said. "Not I accept your apology. Not it's okay. Just I know," which was more honest than either of those things, and more respectful, and more true to who she was. She stood. He stood. They were the last people at the back table. The event staff moved around them with the practiced invisibility of people who understood that some conversations required not being interrupted. "Walk with me," she said. They walked out through the rear of the building onto a terrace that looked out over the harbor. The water was black and quiet, the city lights doing something complicated on its surface. The air was cold, genuinely cold, the kind that required you to pull your coat closed and acknowledge that April in Boston was not April anywhere warmer. She stood at the railing. He stood beside her, not close enough to presume, leaving a gap that she could close or not close on her own terms. She didn't close it, not yet, but she also didn't move away. "I'm not coming back to New York," she said. "The apartment, the life there, that's finished. The Marlborough Street apartment is mine. The organization is here. My work is here." "I know," he said, "and I'm not—" She stopped. She looked at the water. "I'm not prepared to tell you what this is, what it could be. I don't know yet, and I'm not going to say things I don't know to be true. I'm not asking you to. What are you asking for?" She turned her head to look at him. The direct question. The Vivian question. He thought about it. He thought about all the things he could say, the things that were true, and the things that were true but not quite right for this moment, and the things that were true but too large for the cold air over the harbor on a Tuesday night in April. He thought about what was actually, specifically, honestly, being requested. "Time," he said, "to show you something different than what I showed you for 3 years. Not a gesture, not a bracelet. Time." He paused. "And your actual opinion of whether it's going the right direction, when you have one." She looked at him for a long moment. The harbor was doing its quiet thing behind her, and the city lights were doing their complicated thing on the water, and she was standing in the cold air of her own city in the life she had built out of the wreckage of a marriage that had failed to be real. And she was looking at the man who had failed to make it real, And she was making a decision with the same precision she brought to everything else. The same refusal to decide faster than the information warranted. "Okay," she said. One word. The same weight as the 11 she had sent from a dark highway when she saw him standing outside her building, but different. Those 11 had been a boundary. This one was a door. Not flung open, not ceremonially unlocked with dramatic music. Just a door, slightly ajar, opened by someone who had made a decision based on evidence rather than hope. He nodded. They stood there for a few more minutes in the cold, not talking, looking at the water. It was not romantic silence. It was something more modest and more durable than that. The silence of two people who had been through something real and were standing on the other side of it, assessing the territory. The cold was doing what cold does, which is make the body aware of itself, aware of the other body nearby, aware that proximity is not nothing even when everything else is unresolved. She turned first. "I have to go back in. There are people I need to thank." "Go," he said. She took 2 steps toward the door and stopped. She looked back at him. The look lasted only a moment, not searching, not evaluating, just present, the way she looked at things, completely. "You drove yourself," she said. "Yes." "Drive safe going back." "I will." She went inside. He stood at the railing for a moment longer, looking at the harbor, at the city lights making their imperfect reflections on the dark water. He breathed the cold air in and let it out slowly. His hands were in his coat pockets. His chest felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it had the correct amount of room in it. Not full, not resolved, but not compressed by the accumulated weight of everything he had been carrying for months, for years, for the 20 years of building a version of himself that had turned out to be insufficient for the things that mattered. He stayed until the terrace lights timed out, and the building behind him was mostly dark. Then he walked back through the building and out the front, and he got in his car and he sat in it for a moment before starting it. He thought about what she had said at the table. I knew what I was entering, the honesty of it, the way she had declined the easier version of the story, the version where he was simply the person who had done something to her, and had insisted on the more complex and more true version, the one that required her to account for her own choices as well as his. That was not something he had expected. He had been prepared for the version of this conversation where he accepted everything and she remained in the position of the wronged party, which was accurate but incomplete, and she had refused the incompleteness because she was someone who operated incompleteness even when the incomplete version would have been easier and more satisfying. He started the car. He pulled out of the parking structure and onto the street and began the drive back to New York. He drove through the city and then out of it, the highway opening up, the dark of the Massachusetts landscape replacing the lit density of Boston. Somewhere in his chest, beneath the exhaustion of the last 4 months and the cold, and the specific complicated feeling of a conversation that had ended without ending, somewhere under all of that, was the small forward-pointing thing he had felt in his office the night she texted. It was still there, larger now and less fragile, and more like what it actually was, which was not hope in the soft sense of the word, but hope in the harder sense. The specific decision to believe that the work was worth doing, made not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the alternative of not trying, of not showing up, of remaining the man he had been for 3 years of someone's life, was no longer acceptable. The highway ran north to south, and he drove it southward, toward New York, toward the organization in the process of changing, toward Elena, who would want to know how it went, toward Gerald, who had 15 years of history with him and was navigating the new shape of things with a professionalism that bordered on the heroic, toward the penthouse that still had the drawer with the bracelet in it, and the empty space where her books had been and the white orchids he kept replacing because he had never stopped the standing order and had not yet decided what it meant that he hadn't. At some point, somewhere around Providence, the city that had been at the center of everything, that had been the reason Doyle had moved and Prescott had planted, and Adriana Reyes had spent 8 months carrying something heavier than an attorney, 8 months out of school should have had to carry. He understood something he had been circling for months without landing on. The empire was still standing. The organization, the territory, the infrastructure of everything he had spent 20 years building. It was still there, still running, still generating the kind of power that made rooms accommodate themselves to him when he walked in. That wasn't going to vanish overnight, and he was not going to pretend it would. But it was no longer the point. It had stopped being the point, And the strange thing, the thing he hadn't expected, was that its stopping being the point had not made him feel diminished. It had made him feel something else, something he was still finding words for, something in the territory of what Adriana Reyes had called it when she stood at the front of a room in a Harborview building and described making a choice over and over without ceremony. He drove into New York in the early hours of the morning. The city was still going, as it always was, lit up and purposeful and full of its own magnitude. He came up through the tunnel and through the streets and into the building's garage, and he took the elevator up and let himself into the penthouse, and he stood in the entry for a moment. The white orchids were on the entry table. He looked at them. He took out his phone and sent a text to the florist service, cancel the standing order. Then he stood there a moment longer, in the quiet of the apartment, before going to the kitchen and filling a glass of water and drinking it at the counter, the way he always did when he got home late. The drawer with the bracelet was 6 feet away. He didn't open it. It could stay there. It was part of a language he had been speaking for years that had communicated nothing he actually meant. And he was learning a different language now, slowly, without fluency, making the mistakes that come with learning something late. On Marlborough Street in Boston, the windows of the third-floor apartment would be dark by now. She would be home, and the event would be over, and she would be in the particular quiet of someone who had spent real energy on something real and could now rest. He did not text her. He had told her he wanted time, and time was the thing he was going to give her, not daily evidence of his effort, not performances of transformation designed to be witnessed. The work was going to happen where it happened. In him, in the choices, in the accumulation of small and large decisions toward the man he was trying to become. And she would see it or she wouldn't, and she would decide what to do with what she saw, and that decision would be hers. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and felt the quiet of the apartment differently than he had felt it since March. Not as absence, not as the negative space of someone who was no longer there, but as the space of his own life, the life he was responsible for, the life whose quality was determined entirely by what he chose to put into it. He was 41 years old. He had built an empire and lost his wife in the same motion, and he was learning, late, the things that the empire had prevented him from learning earlier. He was not finished learning them. He was not, probably, anywhere near finished. He fell asleep with that thought, which was not comfortable but was honest. And honest was what he had decided to trade comfort for. And the trade, though costly, was the only one he had made in years that felt like it was worth what it cost. Outside, the city held its magnitude, indifferent and lit. The orchids in the entry would drop their petals in a few days and not be replaced. The drawer with the bracelet could stay closed until he knew what to do with it, or until she told him, or until they arrived somewhere together that let them decide. On Marlborough Street, the windows were dark and the apartment was quiet, and Vivian Ashcroft was asleep in the life she had built with her own hands, and it was enough, more than enough, it was hers. And whatever came next would come next on terms she had negotiated herself, in the direct and unsentimental and completely alive way she did everything. They were not where they had been. They were not yet where they were going. They were somewhere in between, which is where most real things live. Not in the dramatic moments of departure or arrival, but in the long, unglamorous, necessary middle of becoming. That was enough, for now. It would have to be. And for the first time in a very long time, for both of them, it was.